Hi everybody, I am here for um, the Fresh New Voice of YA excerpt vlog, and I'm going to be reading from Ash by Malinda Lo. And the scene I'm going to read from is in chapter 5, um, where Ash meets who we later learn is Kaisa, the king's huntress, for the first time during a Yule celebration. Okay. So, I'm going to go ahead and get started. That night, the house was full of light and noise, with people dressed as soldiers and queens and dancers and chieftains. Ash watched them laughing and dancing from her corner in the front hall, and no one noticed her. Halfway through the evening, there was a pounding on the front door, and when Lady Isabel opened it, there seemed to be a gang of thieves on the doorstep. Half a dozen men dressed in worn leather, with caps pulled low over their heads, and hands that seemed to be stained with blood. Even Lady Isabel recoiled at the unexpected ferocity of these visitors, until the men were pushed aside and a woman dressed in hunting gear threw back her green hooded cloak to reveal a smiling face. "Don't mind my men," she said, bowing to Lady Isabel, her dark blonde hair falling over her shoulder in a thick braid. "We come bearing new meat, in return, of course, for a drink or two." The men behind her cheered loudly and thrust forward into the room, one of them carrying the head of a stag, its dead eyes glassy, the tongue hanging out of its slightly open mouth. And I forgot to point out a couple things. Okay, so Ash is living with just her stepmother now. Her mother and father have died, and she's living with her stepmother, who is Lady Isabel. Visibly shaken, Lady Isabel called for Beatrice to attend them, and Ash wondered if it was customary in West Riding for the hunt to come in like that, all bloody and fresh from the kill. But Beatrice came forward without a word, and led two of the men and their haunch of venison into the kitchen. The man with the stag's head began to go into the parlor, but the huntress caught his arm and said something to him in a curt, low tone of voice, and he looked sheepish and took the head outside. The huntress saw Ash then, standing with her back to the wall. She must have had a stricken expression on her face, because the huntress smiled at her and said, "I'm sorry if my boys frightened you. They mean no harm. They've just been in the wood for too long." "I'm not frightened," Ash said, although she had been, just a little. "Did you hunt all day?" "Yes," the huntress said, pulling off her cloak and beginning to yank off her thick leather gloves. "But it's all right if you were afraid," she said with a sideways look at Ash. "It's smart to be afraid of things that smell of death." She came closer to the girl and bent toward her, putting a firm hand on Ash's shoulder. "Just don't be afraid to look them in the eye," she said with a grin, and then ruffled Ash's hair before moving on into the dining room. No one else had paid the slightest attention to her all night, and Ash felt as though the huntress had suddenly called her into being. She slid out from her corner and went after her, watching as the huntress took a seat at the long table with one of her men and a masked reveler dressed as a queen. When they saw Ash standing hesitantly nearby, the man asked, "Whose child is that?" The huntress looked over at her. "Come and sit with us," she said. The woman dressed as a queen smiled at her and asked, "Are you hungry?" Ash shook her head, but came and sat next to the huntress as Sarah poured wine into their goblets. "Where is your costume tonight?" the huntress asked. All around them, the guests were dressed as princesses or lords, their masks glittering with garnets and plumed with feathers. "I do not have one," Ash answered. "Poor thing," said the masked queen. "She needs cheering up." "You could tell her a story," the man prompted, looking at the huntress. The masked queen said, "Yes, a story, a hunting story." The huntress grinned and asked Ash, "Is that what you'd like?" Ash colored, but said, "Yes, I would." "Very well, then," said the huntress. "I will tell you the story of Alis and the Changeling. Do you know that tale?" Ash shook her head. "Alis was one of our earliest huntresses. King Roland called her to service when she was only 18, and many people questioned whether she was ready to lead the royal hunt," the huntress explained. "The same year that Alis was chosen, the queen gave birth to her first child, a girl. But on the morning after the princess was born, the queen went to suckle her child, and she would not eat. Days passed, and the princess continued to refuse her mother's milk, and yet she did not weaken. Instead, her skin turned a curious golden color, and she seemed to grow at an astonishing speed. The green witches were consulted, and they concluded that the princess had been stolen and replaced with a fairy changeling." "Fairies and green witches," said the masked queen. "This is a fairy tale, not a hunting story." The huntress covered the woman's hand with her own and said, "Patience, there will be hunters." She looked back at Ash and continued, The king and queen tried everything they could to trick the changeling into revealing its true identity, for that was the only way to bring the real princess back. But nothing worked, and as the months passed, they began to fear they would never see their daughter again. Now some green witches remembered that there might be one other way to bring the young princess back, but it would require someone to journey to Tanninley and beg the fairy queen to return the child. When Alice heard this, she knew that she must be the one to go, for this was how she could earn the people's trust. She told the king and queen of her intention, and though they were apprehensive, they longed for their daughter's return and agreed to Alice's plan. "What happened to the changeling?" Ash asked curiously. The huntress paused. "I don't know," she answered. "I suppose the changeling remained in the princess's place. At any rate, Alice entered the wood on the day after Souls' Night, and though many doubted she would ever return, on the morning of Yule she was seen riding through the gates of the royal city with a babe in her arms. The king and queen were shocked when she came before them, for she had aged nearly a decade, though she had only been absent 2 months. She told them that when she entered the wood she had ridden for a fortnight, seeking out the center of the great forest, where she discovered a small trail paved with white stones. It eventually became a broad avenue lined with trees she had never seen before, and ended in a set of huge crystal gates. She knew she had arrived at Tanninley. When she told the fairy guard that she sought an audience with the fairy queen, she was taken to a massive palace built of crystal. In the queen's audience chamber, Alice knelt down and asked for the return of the princess. The queen told Alice that her wish would be granted only if she completed 3 tasks successfully. She must retrieve a griffin's egg from its nest. She must bring the fairy queen a living unicorn, and she must hunt the great white stag and bring back its head. If she succeeded, the princess would be returned. So Ayla set out to fulfill those tasks, and none of them was easy. But she had an advantage that the fairy queen did not anticipate. She was young and determined, and she did not know that she could fail. Though it took many months for her to find a griffin, for they were few and far between even in Aelis's time, she did find one at last, and she artfully stole the gold-plated egg from beneath the sleeping beast itself. Though it took many months, she did find a unicorn and lured it, with honey and sweet songs, back to the fairy queen. And though it took many months, she tracked down a white stag whose back was as wide as the avenue in Tanninley, and she slew him with her small human-made sword. In the end, the fairy queen had to honor her words, and she delivered the young princess, no worse for wear, into Aelis's arms. The princess was still a baby, Ash interrupted, even though so much time had passed. Yes, said the huntress. Time passes differently, it is said, among the fairies. And there was always the suspicion afterward that the princess had become something more than human during her time with the fairy queen. When Alis returned to the royal city with the princess, there was a grand celebration, and Alis went back to her duty as the king's huntress. From that time onward, fewer changelings were found in the country, for the fairies don't like to lose what they have stolen. The huntress took a drink from her goblet when she finished her tale, and the 2 revelers seated with her clapped their hands in delight. "A wonderful story," said the woman in delight. Um, did you like it?" the man asked Ash. "Yes," Ash said, and it gave her an idea. She hesitated for a moment and then asked the huntress, "Have you seen a fairy?" In the weeks since her father had died, Ash's memory of her midnight encounter with the fairy hunt had seemed more like a dream than reality. Sometimes she tried to remember what that man had looked like, the one who had spoken to her, but the shape of his face kept sliding away from her mind's eye. Now, looking at the huntress, she thought that if anyone could confirm what she had seen, it would be her. The huntress seemed surprised by her question. "I am afraid I have not," she said. Ash was disappointed, and her face fell. The masked queen said quickly, "But you've said, haven't you, that sometimes you see things in the wood?" The huntress smiled. "I cannot say if those things were fairies." "But they were unusual?" the woman teased. "Indeed, they were unusual," the huntress affirmed. "How?" Ash asked. The huntress put down her goblet and looked at Ash intently. "Sometimes," she said, "at twilight, or in the shade, the light plays tricks. Once I saw something that looked like a woman with wings." "A wood sprite!" exclaimed the woman. "Perhaps," the huntress said. Another hunter came into the dining room then and bent down to whisper in her ear, and the huntress stood up. "I am afraid the time for stories is at an end," she said to Ash, and her companions also rose to leave. "Good night," she said, and briefly bowed her head to Ash. "Good night," Ash answered, feeling let down. Was that all she had seen? She watched them go, their green and brown hunting gear the only solemn colors among the costumed guests. and then went back upstairs. She would rather be alone in her room than alone in the midst of the celebration she was not a part of. I'm going to stop there. I hope you enjoyed it. Later this week there's going to be an excerpt blog featuring an excerpt from Hate List by Jennifer Brown, and I hope you guys will watch that too and comment on it and comment on all the other wonderful things that are happening this week with Jennifer Brown and Malinda Lo. And both Ash and Hate List are out in bookstores now, so go grab a copy. Alright, I'll see you guys later this week. Bye.